so the reason that we feed proteins that are broken down to amino acids by the rumen bacteria is that this NH2 group splits off with the free hydrogen that's in the rumen and creates ammonia, and that is what the bacteria use for protein. The rumen bacteria don't know if it's corn gluten meal or soybean meal or distiller's grains. All they see is ammonia. They haven't read the brochures. Okay? They're pretty small, they're not that bright. They just reproduce every few minutes, and they break things down to this. Okay. So, why do we need protein? Cell membranes. In muscle, nerves, hair, skin, blood serum protein, enzymes, hormones, antibodies. How many of you raise replacement heifers on grass? Okay, let's think about this. The hormones. Hormones are fat soluble. And what does that mean? That means that if those heifers are really, really skinny, they're not going to cycle as early as they will if they're in good body condition, sure. And that's the same across all mammals. When you get to a certain level of leanness, menstrual cycles stop, bulls don't produce semen, so we have to keep in mind that that goes back to protein, to the standpoint that hormones are derived from proteins. Okay, so are antibodies for mounting the immune response. Okay, this may be controversial to any of you who have hair my color. Nitrogen for microbial growth and fermentation in the rumen. Protein is degraded in the rumen to provide ammonia that the bacteria use to grow. All feed protein used in the rumen is broken down to ammonia. Microbial protein from the bacteria that are utilizing that provides about 58% of the amino acids needed by the animal. However, this post-ruminal amino acids supplied to the small intestine and are absorbed for use by the animal. These microbes pass out of the rumen, get to the small intestine where they're broken down. They're broken apart with the abomasum. That hydrochloric acid breaks them apart. The amino acids are absorbed in the small intestine. How many of you have heard of bypass protein? Okay, we're going to talk about what that is, because depending on the diet makes a difference on what type of protein feed you should be feeding to get the maximum use out of that feed. Okay. This I already showed you, I won't bore you with it a third time. Okay. Ammonia, urea. How many of you have heard or believe that urea is bad to feed, that it's dangerous to feed? If you were alive in the 70s and you had lick tanks, suspension technology was not good. And so a lot of companies used a molasses-based lick tank, big tanks. When do producers spend the money for protein, for lick tanks? Pardon?
When the grass is really good, when the hay is.
That's what I hear. All the others were true too. Producers normally are looking for a less labor-intensive way of supplementing cows, especially when the grass is no good. So I want you to imagine that your cows, or bulls, whatever your preference is. It's not a preference really, but whatever you are, you're out there on pasture. You don't have pasture. It's this high. You're competing with the beetles for it, okay? And someone brings a lick tank out to you. And it tastes just like those little things in the center of the table here. It's food. You become a lick tank junkie. Now, those lick tanks were meant to be a supplement, not a milkshake. Okay? So what happens when that animal gets too much ammonia. That ammonia is absorbed across the rumen wall because the bacteria can't take it up. When that happens, animals do get ammonia toxicity. They do die from ammonia toxicity. My basic rule with feeding cattle and using lick tanks and doing those sorts of things is don't create junkies. Give them food sources. Now I will say this, since the 70s, suspension technology has improved greatly. We've learned how to put kegs out that have distiller's grains or corn gluten feed base so that the cattle have to chew it. They just can't stand there and lick it all day long like a lollipop. But what is urea? Urea is two NH2 groups that combine with hydrogen, and there's not a lot else here except a carbon and an oxygen, and because of the molecular weight, this has 281% protein, which means if you are feeding a low protein diet, you can feed a really small amount of urea in with another feed to boost your protein, but urea is gone in the rumen within a minute. That's the thing. The bacteria starve it. They see this, and it's gone within a minute. The whole purpose of urea is to feed the bacteria. You're not feeding the animal, you're feeding the bacteria. Okay. Bacteria that digest cellulose, the cellulolytic bacteria, they prefer ammonia. We've done that for 30 years. So substituting some non-protein nitrogen for a portion of the degradable, and the key word here is portion, is a viable option. It has applications for growing diets that are high in forage. Now, you don't need to follow my recommendation, but nearly every supplement that I formulate, I put 0.4 to 0.5% urea in because it's cheap. And if I'm feeding a high starch diet, it provides nitrogen, boom, right now for the bacteria to grow for that starch that is available immediately. The starch that is bound in a feed like a distiller's grains or a corn gluten feed, or take your pick, cottonseed meal, doesn't matter. The bacteria have to break that apart. But if we're feeding a diet that also has starch in it, and this is back to this being a feedlot class, I want nitrogen there right now to use it. Now, nitrogen is recycled from the blood, but with 0.4% urea, you're not going to create urea toxicity. And you're going to cheapen up your diet. Okay. So, it's used most efficiently on high energy, low protein diets where there is readily available carbohydrate. The low rumen pH in a high grain diet reduces the absorption of ammonia to the blood. So we have less chance of ammonia toxicity because on a low rumen pH it's not absorbed into the bloodstream as well. When we do feed urea, we need to feed a little sulfur, some potassium, and some phosphorus. Now hang on here. Let's say that I'm using, how many of you down here, what are the protein sources you're using? How many of you are using distiller's grains?
We don't have that available.
If you're buying a blend that says grain byproducts, you're using distiller's grains. How many of you are feeding corn gluten meal? Okay, how many of you are feeding corn gluten feed? How many of you are feeding cottonseed meal? What else are you feeding? Peanuts. Peanut balls are lignin. Soybean meal. Good bit of soybean meal. Well, here's the thing, here's what I want to tell you. If you are feeding distiller's grains or corn gluten feed, you don't need to worry about supplementing additional potassium or phosphorus. when you're feeding urea because they're already high in potassium and phosphorus. All that's been taken out is the starch. And so with other things, though, we do need to. So when you feed urea, your nutritionist should look at your diet pretty carefully. Now, we use urea to increase the diet organic matter digestion. In the Middle East, where they have a lot of straw, they actually use urea and treat the straw with urea and various acids, hydrochloric acid, to break down the straw, and they use urea to increase the protein of that. It works the same way if you're feeding a forage, if the cattle are grazing a stockpile forage, or what you called earlier, a low count forage. Urea is a cheap way in feeds as part of it. The two possible problems with urea: ammonia toxicity and reduced feed intake. So never exceed either of these levels with urea. Never more than 1% of the diet dry matter. I cut that in half because I'm conservative. I feed about 0.5% urea. And never more than 1/3 of the total dietary protein. I would use this one as my safety net. Here's one thing: I never use urea in one situation. I never use urea in a diet the first week that I've got weaned calves adapting to a feed bump. Why?
Would you be increasing the amount of acidosis possibility?
It's even simpler than that.
Some of them aren't going to eat.
Pardon?
Some of them are going to eat more than others.
Yeah. Urea. So I'm an old-fashioned nutritionist. When someone calls me out and the cattle aren't eating, I'll take the protein pellet and taste it. And when you do that, if you're working with someone who's buying a cheap product from a company that's pushing these levels, it will remind you of battery acid. Now, it really has a caustic low flavor. Am I?
You're right.
If I'm lying, I'm dying.
No, he's right.
No. And you have to grow up with trucks that had batteries in before you couldn't find them to probably know that. Way back when, for those of you who are younger than 40 in this room, you used to be able to open the hood on a truck and actually see things. When your battery falls out of a 1979 Ford while you're going down the highway, you can't see anything if it's dark. That I know too. The reality of this is, these calves have had grass and maybe some creek feed and milk up until now. And when you've got them in the feedlot and they're trying to learn what that feed bunk is, they're trying to learn what the water is. And by the way, I always leave the water running for a day when I have calves that I'm trying to teach to drink out of the water, because they will hear that. They will figure that out. They'll smell it. And then they go to the feed bunk and you've got urea in that feed. And they're not sure. And they take a bite and you've just burnt their tongue. You have to adapt cattle to urea to do it really well. And we have a lot of data from feedlots that calves that are just weaned, put in a feedlot, a percentage of them, a fairly high percentage, as many as 10 or 15%, don't eat for 4 days. And the reality of it is, if we make it bad on those calves and they don't want to eat for 5 or 6 days, what happens at day 10? We have an outbreak. They're sick. They're not able to mount an immune response, and they're exposed to a bunch of new pathogens from all their new friends that come from 50 different farms. And so the reality of it is, urea can be good, but there's that one time I don't use it. Okay. So, a little more about rumen protein fiber degradation. Our goal is to maximize forage digestion in order to increase performance such as average daily gain or milk production, and milk production also means on that cow and the cow-calf pair. So we look at ruminally degradable protein. The dairy industry calls this digestible intake protein. It's been reported to be the first limiting nutrient for beef cattle grazing low-quality forages. So, the digestible intake protein means protein digested in the rumen. The fastest source is urea. Okay. And then we have what's called bypass protein. It's protein that escapes degradation in the rumen, instead digested in the abomasum and small intestine, and absorbed as amino acids in the small intestine. The two sources of bypass protein are undigested protein, which bypasses digestion in the rumen, and then the rumen microbial protein. Okay, people. So, when I am looking at ruminal protein and fiber degradation, and I'm trying to decide which I want if the relative costs are the same, I want to look at my rumen bypass value. So, brewer's grains has a lower bypass value than dry distiller's grains or corn gluten meal or even cottonseed meal or soy hull. So if I am trying to maximize rumen fiber digestion, I would prefer to use sources of protein that have less bypass value to give more of that nitrogen, that ammonia available in the rumen. And my two choices might be corn gluten feed and wet brewer's grains. Now, let's say from a cost standpoint, we don't have either of those, but we have this, where we have distiller's grains. But they have a higher bypass value. How do I make up for that? I feed 0.5% urea. I make up for that little deficiency and I cheapen my diet some at the same time. Okay, Keith. So, low bypass proteins. Soybean meal on a 20 to 30% forage diet has a really, really high use in the rumen, 70 and 80%. Peanut meal, very available in the rumen, and urea, 100% available in the rumen. So if I'm trying to optimize forage digestibility, these would be the choices that I would have. Okay, Keith. Medium bypass proteins. Soybean meal goes to about 40% bypass on a high grain diet from 20%. Cottonseed meal, dehydrated alfalfa, corn grain, brewers, dried grains. Okay. And finally, high bypass proteins. Corn gluten meal, dried distiller's grains is about 60%. Fish meal, which we don't use that much of anymore, is about 68%. So here's something that you may run into when you buy feed. If you're buying from a company and it says grain byproducts and the protein supplement, try to find out what the breakdown of that is. They should be able to tell you. Their formulators can tell you if you get it. It varies by week, by price, which is why they put them on tags that way. But if I don't know, my safety net is always, I go back to urea as a safety net. Now, this is a philosophical debate. There are programs out there that advertise that they're all natural protein and that they don't use urea because they're an all-natural protein. And that's great marketing, but that urea is broken down to NH2, just the same as all of our feed available in the room. So from a practical standpoint, it doesn't really make a difference. It may make a difference depending on your marketing to your consumers, but from the animal standpoint, it's broken down and we don't worry about it. Okay. So, when you are buying proteins, there's also something called the Maillard reaction. And what it is I'll just read it to you. When in the processing of the bulk plant and animal products from we get protein supplements, the carboxyl group of the sugar is bound to the free amino end of lysine. And the only reason I'm repeating this is because of lysine. If heating is excessive, that protein has a greater bypass value, but the problem is it may not be available to the animal. Okay, Keith. This is what's called the color wheel. And if you are buying distiller's grains, what color is corn?
Yellow.
Yeah, yellow golden. So if you look at this color wheel and you get over to here, this is heat damage. I'm going to tell you a true story. There was a producer in Ohio that I worked with who was notoriously frugal. And he had a great buy on distiller's grains at $50 a ton when the price was about $200 a ton. And he brought me a sample of it, and it was just a little bit darker than this. And I said, don't buy it. And he said, why? And I'm like, it's heat damage. And he said, but it's such a good buy. Okay, it was a good buy. About 5 months later, he called me because his heifers were aborting. And that was what he was feeding for protein. And we got into a real wet, cold spring. And spring, early March, was in the 30s and misty, raining for about 3 weeks. And those cattle didn't have enough protein to maintain themselves and the calf. And an animal's initial thing is survival. So they abort when they are nutritionally deficient and can't carry the fetus. So be careful of that. Now, for those 3 of you in the back who raised your hand that you had sheep, sheep are like the canaries of heat damage. They're kind of like we used to put canaries down the coal mines to shaft to see how the air quality was. The reality of it is sheep don't like heat damage. They can taste it. So if you're ever feeding sheep, which hopefully you won't have to, they don't like things beyond about here. And so I used to do sheep nutrition too. And when you have a feedlot that has 5,000 feeder lambs go off feed, and all you do is you look at the color of the feed, and it was just one heat damage load through an entire group off feed immediately. They will not eat it. Yes.
Why does it ever get to that point? Are they extracting more starch out of it?
No sensors go bad.
Oh, okay.
Usually those heat damage things are just when there is a problem. You know, a sensor doesn't sense the temperature correctly. Many times they dump it. You know, the reality of it is, from cost of proteins, I used to work with people who worked with a lot of zoo animals. They buy the very best proteins. They would all be up here. Exotic animals, followed by horses, followed by dairy cattle, and we're kind of down here. So a lot of what other animals won't eat or they can't feed because of liability, they get mixed into beef diets. But you will see a lot of variation in feeds, especially commercial blends of feeds. You can pick out these dark colors and see that they're mixing it up. Okay, so this goes back to your question earlier, your comment earlier. When energy is limiting, either because of low quality forage or in production situation where there is a reduced dry matter intake, such as newly received calves that are not eating a lot of feed, microbial protein reach in the small intestine is not sufficient to meet animal requirements. And we feed a combination of bypass and non-bypass feeds. So the reality in production situations, we feed combinations of corn gluten feed and distiller's grains and peanut meal and urea to come up with a balance. because we do want to balance in the feedlot situation. Okay, Pete. So, let's talk about protein requirements. They change with age. So, young animals need a higher percent protein in their diet due to the fact that they're in a stage of really rapid tissue growth, and they have a low feed intake relative to their demands. So, if you are buying bulls, let's say one of your selection criteria might be a higher yearling weight or weaning weight. Those animals genetically have the ability to probably gain in excess of 4 pounds a day, even as young animals. So, because they have the genetic ability to put that on, we can limit their growth simply by limiting their protein. And I'll show that to you here in a second. Okay. Protein requirements also change with body frame size. The actual amount of protein intake in grams, and there are 454 grams per pound, increases as the body weight, the body frame, or projected mature body size increases. What does this mean? If you have a medium frame steer, this is an M1 steer, weighing 550 pounds, and it's gaining 2.2 pounds a day, it has a crude protein requirement of 720 grams. If you have a large frame steer, weighing the exact same weight, gaining the exact same, its crude protein requirement is 762 grams. So here's something I want you to know. Protein requirements are not in percentages. Protein requirements are in grams per head per day, and it varies by the level of production. We talk percentages because we can't sell a feed based upon grams. No one would understand it. We all understand basically that magical 12% protein diet. It's easy to understand, it's also wrong. I need you to understand that. I need you to understand that protein requirements are really based on grams. So, this is what it means. If I had protein requirements also change with level of production. Now, I have a medium frame steer weighing 550 pounds. This is pounds per day gain. At a half pound per day gain, it only needs 450 grams of protein. If I'm selling that calf at $2.50 a pound, and I want to get it up to 2.2 pounds per day, it needs 720 grams of protein. Folks, when I'm developing creep feeds, my creep feeds are 16 to 18% protein. When I'm developing feedlot receiving diets for the calves y'all are producing, or your calves if you're weaning them and feeding them for yourself, the first 2 weeks in the feedlot, when I know feed intake is low because they're adjusting, my standard diet is 17% protein. And it's that because feed intake is low. Okay? Why do I have 16% crude protein in a creep feed? Because I don't just want to create a butterball with more energy. I want to create lean gain. I want to create frame. I want to create muscle. And it goes directly to this. More protein in grams we get to by formulating a higher percent protein. But our goal is to get more grams of protein into the animal. Okay. Now, how do you figure this? You have a 750-pound steer that's eating 17 pounds of an 88% dry matter diet. It's dry corn and supplement. And that diet is formulated to be 12.5% crude protein. You convert the intake to dry matter basis to get rid of water. There's no crude protein in water. So I take my 17 pounds of feed times the dry matter of my feed, and I find out that I'm feeding basically 15 pounds of dry matter. check to make sure this is reasonable. The check is the cattle eat about 2% of their body weight. So if I take this 14.96 pounds of dry matter divided by 750%, they're eating 2% of their body weight. The reason I'm showing you this is because you can use these examples and figure them out at home based upon the feed tag. If you're between 1.5% and 3%, you're good. Okay. So, now this is where it gets, I'll be real honest with you. If any of you do this, this is where we lose those really smart students that get into UGA. This is the slide where we lose them. And I had one class where I'm like, okay folks, they were lost. And I'm like, how many ounces are in a cow? That's what I thought at the time. You got a whole bunch of answers. Ask how many cups are in a quart. Oh boy. We need home ec
I was just
back in the schools. So that, or if you have children or grandchildren that are old enough not to put their hand on a hot stove, that could be an IQ thing, but I'm thinking of height mainly. Okay, if they can do that, buy them a cake box, give them a measuring cup, make them learn a life skill that tastes good, okay? Please, because if you have little practical anything, this is a lot easier. Okay, so the metric system. A kilogram is 1,000 grams. It weighs 2.02 pounds. A pound has 454 grams. So if I take 454 times 2.205, I come out with 1,000 grams. So, in this example, my 15 pounds of dry matter times 454 grams per pound meant that they were eating 6,792 grams of dry matter intake times the 12.5% crude protein. They were getting 848 grams of crude protein.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. So, you can convert it, you can do it a different way, you still come out with 848 grams. Don't worry about small differences. I just took this out to one decimal place. I didn't need to. Go ahead, Keith. So, let's figure this out. This is how this can be useful. As an animal grows, its gram protein requirement increases, but the percent protein in the diet needed to meet the requirement decreases. So I have my 550-pound medium frame steer gaining 2.2 pounds a day, eating 200% of its body weight. It requires 720 grams of crude protein. If it's eating 2% of its body weight, it's eating 11 pounds of dry matter. That is 49.94 grams of dry matter, but it needs 720